Hey, Wilson.
Hey, how are you doing?
All right, how about you?
Good.
All right, yeah, we'll get started in just a little bit. Do you want me to introduce you or just want to do it yourself?
I mean, it doesn't make a difference to me. I'm good either way.
Yeah, I think everybody yesterday just introduced themselves.
That's
So,
fine. That's fine. And when
uh,
I present, if I put it in presenter mode, does that work on here? Do you know with your notes and stuff?
uh, I do not know, honestly.
All right. Well,
Uh,
if I pull it up, I'm gonna pull it up right now. Let me know if it's showing the notes and stuff, or if I need to do something different. Um,
okay. Yesterday, I know when people put up their presentations, their PowerPoints, you couldn't see any notes. You just saw the PowerPoint. But I don't know if they were in presenter mode or not.
all right. Let's see.
And you have to make sure, I think, we were having issues yesterday. I think you have to share your whole screen is what you have to select.
All right. See, a few minutes ago, I was just clicking on that and it was showing. So I guess if I pull this up now, do you see the presentation?
Yeah, I see the presentation.
All right. So it may, so if I start from beginning and then I'm going to do presenter view, do you still see just the full screen slide?
No, I see the next slide and the
Okay.
notes.
Okay. Well, I will not do presenter view then.
Okay. All right. Well, I will jump back off and if you want to wait just a couple minutes after 10:15 just to give people time to get logged in. Um,
That's fine. Now, is there a way to see if people type comments or anything or not when I'm in this full screen?
um, I don't know if you can. Since I hadn't tried it yet, I don't know what it does. But if you can't, just say you can't see the chat, and if anything comes up in the chat, I can come back in and let you know. I
Yeah,
think
the
I
way
think I'm
it's
the
set
only
up.
one. I'm the only one that'll be able to talk to you. Nobody else has the option to be able to speak. All they can do is type in the chat. So, but if
That's
I
fine.
yeah, but if I see anything comes back up, I'll turn my camera back on so I can let you know.
That'll be fine. We'll give it another minute.
Okay. All right. If you need anything, just let me know.
All right, we'll give it another minute and then we'll get started in just a second. Give everybody time to get in. All right, well, it's 10:17, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Wilson Mize. I'm obviously a registered environmental health specialist with the Division of Public Health, overseeing the state's private drinking water well program. So when I was asked a few months ago to speak about our program, the topic was similar to the on-site topic yesterday of private drinking water wells, kind of then and now. The only issue with our program is there isn't a great deal of then. The program is still fairly new in comparison with the on-site wastewater program. So I'm going to try to go through kind of where it began, how it started roughly 40, 50 years ago, and kind of where we're at now and where we hope to be in the next 10 to 20 years. So North Carolina has approximately 52% of North Carolina's population depends upon groundwater for its drinking water supply. Roughly 2.7 million people, residents in North Carolina, are served by privately owned individual wells. Almost 1.5 million are served by groundwater community water systems. So those are obviously regulated by public water supply. And then close to 1 million households are served by privately owned individual wells. So a little history of where this program began. In 1967, North Carolina passed the Well Construction Act, began working on the first set of rules. And this first set of rules, the original 2 CO100 rules, went into effect January 1st, 1972. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, the program that we currently have did not begin until July 1st, 2008. So again, it's fairly new program, been here about 12 years, and obviously trying to constantly make this program better. This is just an example of what 2 CO 107 that we currently use for well setbacks and well construction. This was the original excerpt from the rules back in the early 70s. As you can see, there weren't a great deal of, I guess, setbacks to potential contamination. Believe it or not, there was a setback then from property lines, which we no longer have. But it was a very small, short, brief set of rules that we tried to enforce as best we can. Over time, these rules have been revised or updated to what we currently know as the 2C well construction standards. They were basically 6 or 7 times now, and most recently, August 1st, 2019, last year, was our most recent revision. So the rules that we know today have undergone drastic changes since the 70s, and that was to not only protect public health, but protect the groundwater resources in North Carolina. Another item that was determined almost 20 years ago that was needed to further protect the groundwater resources was licensing of well contractors. Prior to 2000, they were simply registered, so there was no level of expertise that had to be shown. There was no experience that was required. Essentially, anybody could go out, get a well rig, and start drilling a well at your home and provide water to your family. And at that time, obviously, there was not a great deal of enforcement, so there were a lot of well construction violations that were occurring. And the General Assembly decided that back in 1997 that we needed to begin licensing all well contractors. So that's why you check their card when you go to the site now, because they're kind of held to a higher standard. We want to know that they know what they're doing, that they know how to properly protect the well, properly site that well, and make sure that we're providing residents with clean water resources. So why are well construction and water quality programs needed? Obviously, we want to assure the quality of water is suitable for human consumption. The goal is also statewide consistency and enforcement of construction standards, and then coordination with the issuance of the on-site wastewater permit. So from a public health perspective, which is more important, the well or septic system? Obviously, they're both equally important. You've got one that is treating the water as it leaves your home, but we also want to know what's coming into your home. You know, we're consuming that water. We want to make sure it's not a public health risk. So why have we permitted septic systems for the last roughly 60 years, but not wells? Suitable soil for septic systems is limited and not evenly distributed throughout the state. So you have to search for those suitable soils. So it makes sense that we've been permitting these for ages. But when a well is drilled on a residential lot, it was always assumed that there will be an adequate supply of water. Most of the time we can find a spot on a property to install the well, but it doesn't always mean that it's enough water for that home or that it's suitable water quality. So it's, again, assumed that the quality of the water is safe. And that's why we have sampling requirements now to make sure that we're providing residents with kind of an overview of what their water quality looks like. So why was a statewide private well program needed? We wanted to assure that the groundwater is being consumed from the well is safe to drink. We wanted, again, that consistency, and we wanted to coordinate because we're issuing a septic permit, but we weren't always drawing up well areas, or we may put the well where the repair area needs to be 10 years from now if that system were to ever fail. And when that system fails, not only are you putting a financial burden on the resident to repair their septic system, but now we may have to abandon the original well and relocate it. So now we, in coordination with that septic permit, we can go ahead and put the well in an area outside of the initial and repair. So what brought about the need for permitting? Obviously, I mentioned we did not begin a statewide well permitting program until July 1st of 2008. And one of the things that triggered the General Assembly to begin requiring such programs was a 5-part series in the News and Observer. That is the second largest paper in North Carolina. It's located in Raleigh. So it was distributed throughout the state. And what it did was it identified the need to further protect the groundwater resources and the well owners. Now, you probably can't see this that well, but it was front page articles. First day was discussing how the state is failing to ensure that your water is tested. Then there was, articles on clean wells are left to chance. And then at the end, it talked about Governor Mike Easley wanting to obtain funding to create well programs to protect residents from potentially contaminated wells. And here's an example of one of those that was published on March 26, 2006. It discusses a resident in Wake County that had a colorless liquid that was contaminated. Their well was contaminated and they never knew it. And you can see at the bottom of that article, Representative Bernard Allen is referenced in there. And if you're not familiar with the well program, the Bernard Allen Memorial Fund is one that we discuss quite often because they created a fund in Representative Allen's name that provides treatment. It has provided wells for residents that may have contaminated well water. So that is one of the good things that came out of some of this legislation. But as you can see, they reference that the state has more than 25,000 contaminated sites, but no law to ensure wells are safe. One thing to keep in mind, even with the advances our program has made today, there is still nothing that says we can require you to do something with your well if it comes back contaminated. But we are able to now provide additional recommendations and hopefully guide homeowners to treatment options or other options to better protect themselves that they would not have had 20 years ago. So at the time of these articles, 2006, there were 8 state employees that oversaw well concerns. So again, at that time, we were not permitting wells statewide. The 8 employees were employees at the DE, what then was the DWQ regional offices. And what they generally dealt with were complaints. If a homeowner called and said their well was contaminated or it was too close to a septic or there was something going on, they would go out and investigate, and they would often consult with the driller. But it was nowhere near the level of correspondence we now have with residents. And at that time, there were only 35 counties that had some form of well construction oversight. So this was a map we put together back prior to the program beginning in 2008. And DEQ had essentially located counties throughout the state that they considered to be problem areas. And that doesn't mean it was anything that the county was doing incorrectly. It was more so we had well contractors in that area that were not licensed. They were potentially installing wells and should not have been doing so because, again, they didn't have the appropriate licenses. That may have been carryover from 2000 where, a lot of them had to be licensed and then some never made it through the hoop to get licensed. And so it was an honor system. Now you can see in the Piedmont area was our least problem area because you had many counties that had very thorough well programs at the time: Wake, Durham, Orange, Alamance, Guilford. So well contractors in that area were accustomed to being inspected and having some form of permitting in place. But you can see the further east and the further west you went, kind of the outskirts of the state, it tended to be problem areas, and especially down at the coast because you're not dealing with a lot of rock wells. It's a little easier to drill when you're only going 70, 80 feet in some cases, drilling through sand, unconsolidated material. But at that time, we were seeing a lot of well construction violations. So it was important that we try to get the rules right when we were required to do so in 2008 to permit these and protect these a little further. So change was coming. New regulations were on the way. We had the articles in the News and Observer. We had several prominent legislators who down east had wells that were contaminated, and there was a strong push to adopt rules at that time. So Session Law 2006-202, House Bill 2873 was passed very soon after the articles in the News and Observer. We finally had enough attention statewide to get some sort of program in place. And what this bill did was it required the permitting, inspection, and testing of private drinking water wells. So instead of having 35, 36 counties with local well programs, it now mandated that every single county in the state had a well program, required that every county issue permits, perform site evaluations, issue a construction permit, and requires a certificate of completion. So it's somewhat mirrored the wastewater permitting rules and tried to simplify things as much as possible, while at the same time making sure we're inspecting the most important processes within well construction. So we've just discussed how at 2006 time period, we had roughly 8 state people that could go out and assist with well violations. Now we have close to 400 environmental health specialist staff that are authorized in the private well program. So we have a lot more boots on the ground now, a lot more eyes out there looking at these sites. And we're also out issuing a lot of permits on sites with either new or existing wells. So it just made sense for this to be handled at the local level. There's no way that the state would ever have the manpower to look at every well out there, every lot out there. I can safely say well construction violations have decreased tremendously because we're out there now. We're making sure they're grouted. We're making sure they meet the setbacks. And if they don't, you're reaching out to us, and we're trying to address those concerns up front. The days of just going out to a drinking water well and finding that it was not constructed to today's standards is very rare. There's still some that slip through the cracks because they may be a replacement well, but we have drastically reduced the number of NOVs that are needed annually for well construction violations. Also, work by uncertified well contractors is much more closely monitored and reported. Some of the well contractors that did not want to be inspected by county staff, knowing that they were going to get calls to come out and grout or watch grout inspections, some of them went the route of installing irrigation wells. So, those are in many counties, they are not inspected. So we still come across violations here or there. Somebody that has decided to install a well illegally, especially in the coastal plain. But we are out there inspecting the industry much more closely. So there's very few out there that are still uncertified performing, at least installing wells. You may have some out there doing repair work or, alterations to a well that aren't appropriately licensed, but I can safely say the number of those has decreased tremendously as well. And we've been able to shift focus from construction to water quality or public health. So that's kind of what I'll get into next is how this program is improving. And that when 2008 came around, our mindset, kind of our top priority was how to permit wells, how to inspect wells. And we've all statewide pretty much become accustomed to those processes. The goal now is to take it one step further and ensure that residents are safe, that their water quality is safe. So there are improvements. I'll discuss several laws that have been passed over the past, I would say, 5 or 6 years, as well as goals that we at DHHS have moving forward with assisting counties with additional programs locally. So one example is Session Law 2013-122, House Bill 396. And what this says is that the rules shall require local health departments to educate citizens for whom new private drinking water wells are constructed, and for citizens who contact local health departments regarding testing existing well. So you can already see 7 years ago, there was a shift by the General Assembly to begin promoting more outreach, to begin discussing water quality issues for existing wells. When this program started in 2008, our mindset was all about newly permitted private drinking water wells. So there were some counties out there, if they received a call from a homeowner about a well that was drilled in the 80s, they might say that's not really our purview. We deal with new wells permitted after 2008. But that's somewhat of a disservice to the residents of that county, because we should be providing, using our knowledge that we have about well construction and water quality standards, and promote clean water for everybody. I mean, it's a major issue. It's a hot topic in this state the past few years. So as early as 7 years ago, you could start to see this shift and this change in our thinking when it comes to this program. Some of the requirements in that law was that we provide the scope of testing. We provide optional testing. We discussed the limitations of both the required and optional testing. And then we discussed minimum drinking water standards. And I'll get into that a little more of how we've finally gotten to the point where I feel like we're providing this. And then you've probably heard us go around over the past several years. So in 2014, the EMC was required to adopt rules for private drinking water wells that will be installed within 1,000 feet of a known source of release of contamination. So myself and John Brooks has been going around almost monthly to various counties that have requested, and we're trying to get everybody up to speed with the well permitting decision tool. So we just talked about in 2013, there was that shift to providing more guidance to well owners concerning potential risk with their well. Are they near a gas station? Are they near an old landfill? What should they be sampling for? And we didn't want to put all that responsibility to provide that recommendation on the county. So we worked for the past several years with DEQ to create this database that hopefully provides all the information we need to hand out to residents when we permit wells or when we're looking at existing wells. So these rules basically provide a notice of what could be around that site, any known risk of issuing a permit for the construction of a private well on that site. Our goal was to create a simple online tool. So as you can see, this legislation was passed almost 6 years ago, and we finally got the database needed to make this at least feasible back in August 1st of last year is when we began asking counties to start using this tool. So this tool identifies well sites that need notice. So we need to make adjoining properties aware that there are potential risk with a well going in on their property. We inform that well owner about their risk, and we recommend additional sampling. There are no requirements in the legislation or the rules to provide additional safeguards with the well construction. So we're not telling somebody they have to do a full length grout or put treatment on their well, but we're providing them with enough information that they can make a well-informed decision as to what they want to do moving forward. And this is an example. This is a property that we did a search for, 417 East Warwick Mill Road. And you can see there are 2 known sources of release of contamination within that 1,000-foot radius. So when we permit a new well, we should be searching this database for every single application that comes in. And we're providing this screenshot to the applicant that shows there are 2 sites. One of them is a UST site and one of them is a Superfund site. Now, most of the sites you pull up are not going to have a handful of known sources of release of contamination. Oftentimes, there's either none or maybe one, unless you're within the city limits. You may have multiple gas stations and such. And you also need to keep in mind that just because a site shows up does not mean that there is contamination in the groundwater. It can just mean that there was a leak. There was some sort of release that was documented at DEQ, and they had to address it. They may have removed the soil. It may be a no further action. But we are required by law to provide the applicant a copy of this to show them that there are sites within 1,000 feet. And you can take it one step further and click on the site and it will show you the name of the site. It will show you where it's located. It will also provide you with fact sheets that we are required to provide the applicant. So this would be an example. So the site I showed you a few slides back had a UST site. So we would click on that and we would provide the applicant with this fact sheet. What it does is it describes what an underground storage tank site is. And then we are trying to address that 2013 legislation with what should they be sampling for, because every site's going to be different. There may be elevated benzene, there may be toluene. And instead of trying to spend days for each of these applications determining exactly what contaminant we should be looking for, we tried to provide an overview that at most of your underground storage tank or above ground storage tank sites, if there is some sort of contamination, we would be recommending sampling for VOCs, SVOCs, and metals. So if the applicant comes to you and says, how can I make sure that my water quality has not been affected by a neighboring site, they could sample for all these compounds and we can see if there's any exceedances. It also provides contact information to the underground storage tank section. So if you're located, in Raleigh, in Wake County, and they want more information, this fact sheet provides them with who to contact at the Raleigh Regional Office. You also have, because of the well tool, you can click on the site and it gives you the incident number and name. So it gives you all the information that they need to begin additional conversations with the UST section to see if they should do more, if they shouldn't drill a well. They can get that information from the state, where it used to take us a lot more digging just to find out if there's a site there, and then finding out what the name of the site is, what the incident was. Here's another example of the fact sheet. So if there's a solid waste landfill nearby and we're permitting a well, then this provides them with who they should contact. And you'll see a little difference here in that every landfill can be different. So there's kind of sampling recommendations that the solid waste section will provide based on site by site characteristics. So that is where they would need to reach out to the solid waste section to get additional information. And as you're seeing, there's a huge transition to looking more closely at public health and water quality. So we do work much more closely with OEEB now. They have what they've called the Well Water and Health Program, which is focusing on water quality. And there's more work being done on current and emerging contaminants. So we're all pretty much familiar, if you're within the well program, with the household waste that we deal with daily. So is somebody spreading termiticides around the house too close to a well, or pesticides, or they're fertilizing their lawn, industrial waste. So we're pretty familiar with this. We're getting a little better with some of the naturally occurring issues. And those are what we consider the monitored contaminants. So we're accustomed to sampling for bacteria. We're looking at E. coli, we're looking at total coliform. We're accustomed to sampling for the 17 or 18 analytes in the inorganic samples, which give us a broad overview of what could be going on with that water quality. And then the reporting. We're obviously reporting the water samples for all new wells to the resident. We're also reporting health risk evaluations. So OEE has been working diligently to get us an online tool for HREs, and hopefully we'll have that soon. But in the time being, we're issuing paper reports, and we should be doing this for every single well we sample. So some of the contaminants that we're looking more closely at, obviously arsenic. That's always a hot topic because we've got kind of that Carolina slate belt area that you see in that dark shaded area in the southern Piedmont area of the state, where we see arsenic in a lot of wells. And they're oftentimes elevated levels, and most of the time they're naturally occurring. So there's not a whole lot we can do to avoid this if wells are needed in those areas. But we provide them with information. We try to educate homeowners that, arsenic is oftentimes naturally occurring in the rocks and soil. It can come from industrial agricultural activities, but long-term, arsenic can cause cancer. So it's one of the known carcinogens that we deal with naturally occurring in well water. And then we try to provide options to mitigate or treat. So, that's our next step. If you know you have it, then what do? Homeowners always ask, how do I make my water quality safe? So we're trying to provide counties with enough knowledge to be able to have a good conversation with an applicant or a permit, a property owner, on how to resolve some of the issues that we encounter. And luckily, there are very few contaminants out there that cannot be treated. It just comes down to cost. Manganese is another one that we've dealt with for years. Run into this a lot throughout the state. Iron and manganese kind of go hand in hand in wells throughout North Carolina. Naturally occurring in most instances, can have some health concerns. So these are additional contaminants that are monitored for every new well that we try to provide health risk evaluations for. Obviously, it can cause neurological damage in young children, infants, developing fetus. But again, there are treatment options out there. And so there's ways to mitigate the contaminants that we're dealing with. So the goal with OEE and DHHS is to monitor some of the trends with these contaminants. So Dr. Crystal Lee Powell Jackson is doing a great job at trying to track where we're seeing elevated levels. And obviously we know with some of these manganese and arsenic, those kind of hot areas, but we're trying to track some of these other concerns. And then trying to help understand the health impacts, help determine treatment types, and then develop fact sheets that the counties can provide to residents so that they're, again, well informed. They can make a good decision based on the facts. But what we're running into more and more now are the unmonitored contaminants. So if you watch the news in North Carolina, it's almost monthly there's some water quality concern throughout this state. The Dan River spill is one of those examples. So back in 2014, there was a lot of coal ash that spilled into the Dan River. There were concerns that it was poisoning wells. We were on weekly calls with multiple state agencies. So this was a big deal. And obviously there were concerns about hexavalent chromium in the wells. And chromium-6 is one of the big water quality concerns that we've been dealing with in this state. And that can be related to coal ash. It can also be related to industrial waste. And what we're seeing as well is that it's very likely that it's naturally occurring throughout this state, because we've seen it in many counties where there have been sampling events specifically looking for contaminants such as chromium-6. And they're in areas that may or may not be anywhere close to coal ash field or coal ash ponds. So there's the assumption, there's a lot of work being done now to prove this, but there's the assumption that it's naturally occurring. And if you're old enough to remember the Aaron Brockovich movie, this was one of the contaminants or the contaminant in that movie that was causing deaths and cancer. And so it's a big deal. It can be treated. And we run into issues with contaminants such as this because there's oftentimes not an EPA MCL that we can point to and say, this is what the federal government says is a safe limit. And there's goals to hopefully have such limits down the road. But when it comes to something like chromium-6, it also shows up in municipal water supplies. So if EPA passes some sort of level, then all of those community systems out there or public water systems that may have elevated levels are going to have to provide treatment. So there's always a risk factor, but also a financial factor when it comes to some of these contaminants. But as you can see, here's some mapping that's undergone, trying to look at above the 0.07 parts per billion, which is kind of our North Carolina public health goal. It's one that was established through research and the medical industry to determine that that's a safe level. Whether or not that is the level that EPA would look at if they were to create a goal, we don't know. But you can see there have been a lot of samples collected, and there's been a lot of elevated samples. So, and trying to figure out, is it due to a certain geology? And that's kind of what we're looking at. There's still not enough evidence out there yet, but you can see there are coal ash ponds, and some of these elevated levels are pretty far away, if not, hundreds of miles away. So there's a good chance a lot of this is naturally occurring. And then obviously we already sampled for total chromium, but that doesn't always give us a good picture of where the chromium-6 is. But you can see there are hot spots throughout the state as well for the total chromium. So the goal is to provide more support for the local health departments and the citizens. We're all required now at the local level to provide a much more information than we were 10 years ago, and that falls on the county. We're doing a disservice to the residents in our county if we're not providing these maps and these health risk evaluations, because if we don't, then they're going to consume that water for many years, assuming that it's safe. And just sending the results from the lab does not always do enough, because they don't know how to, many homeowners, your average homeowner doesn't know how to read those results. They see numbers and they see goals and they see MCLs, but they don't really know what that means and to what magnitude. Is it a 1 in a million risk for the levels of arsenic they have in their home, or is it a 1 in 1,000 risk? So those are things we need to help residents understand. We try again to determine treatment types and again develop fact sheets for these unregulated contaminants. So another hot topic that you've probably heard about in the state are radionuclides. That is something that Wake County has been investigating for several years now. And you can see the map on the left shows samples, and they've collected many more samples since this date, and probably have a lot more, I guess, data at this point than what is shown here. But you can see a lot of the red dots where there are high levels are in that Roseville granite that you see shaded in pink on the right. So there are certain geologic formations in this state that are more prevalent to have radionuclides. So what are they? They're elements found in certain rocks. They give off radiation as they break down, and it can definitely affect your health. It can cause kidney damage to various forms of cancer. And then it comes down to, again, how do we mitigate? So the radiologicals that we run into can be treated, but it comes down to, is it radon? Is it uranium? What form of radiation is it? So that's where it's our job, if they're in areas that we have identified as more susceptible to have radionuclides, it's our job to provide that resident with information as to, do you want to sample for this? This is how to sample for various radiologicals in your well, because it's not required in our rules. Somebody has to begin that conversation with the residents. Somebody has to provide them with that information, because if not, they're not going to know. So you can see throughout the state, uranium, they were sampling back in the 70s, and it was showing up at that time. So it's not a new topic, but it's something that's being looked at much more closely these days, because rightfully so, the media has taken this and made it a big deal. And finally, people are catching on that this is something we need to be more concerned with. But there are gaps in the data. There are areas such as Wake County where we say, okay, here's a geologic formation that is more likely to result in high levels of radionuclides. But then there's also parts of the county where we would say probably a good chance that there's not going to be anything, but it still shows up. You can see in that zoomed in box where the USGS found high levels of uranium, but it's not in the area that we would suspect it to be in Wake County. So that's where there may be overlaying geologies that aren't showing up on geologic maps, and there may be information that we can only get through groundwater sampling. Radon, very similarly. We don't have an MCL for this, but we have an advisory goal, and radon can be very harmful if inhaled. So without a homeowner being aware that they have a radon issue, they could be bathing or cooking and have no clue that they're affecting their health in their home. And you can see where there's elevated levels that have been detected throughout the state. Radon is a big issue, especially in the western portion of the state. So again, just like everything else, we're trying to understand these health impacts and determine treatment types and develop fact sheets and frequently asked question documents for residents. Just easy handouts that you can provide the homeowner. And PFAS is kind of one that we touch on the most recently because that has been one of the biggest topics concerning groundwater and surface water in North Carolina the past few years. So down in New Hanover County and then the Chemours plant in Cumberland County, there has been groundwater identified to be contaminated with extremely harmful contaminants. So when we talk about PFAS, obviously we get into the Gen X. So here's a map of the Chemours plant and all the sites around there that either have been non-detect or above the 150. And there's quite a few. So that radius keeps expanding. This is an older map, but as DEQ has gone out and water samples have been collected, if we start finding elevated levels, then we continue to expand that radius until we hopefully get to a point where there is no contamination at a certain distance. The problem is there's also beliefs that it could be carried through rainwater. So if we have improperly constructed wells, older wells that were never grouted, there's a risk that runoff could be causing some of that contamination. So what are PFAS? They're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's roughly 5,000 surfactants. They talk about it's used at runways, so anywhere near airports. Fire departments have used this. So training sites could be affecting nearby wells, and then obviously industrial sites. So the General Assembly provided funding to create the PFAS network. So there are 190 municipal surface water sources, 148 municipal well water resources. So they are looking at the water quality. They're constantly monitoring the water quality. But again, you have to look at this entire discussion about private drinking water wells, and the reason it takes our agency and the county's work to improve this program is because private wells are not regulated. So any of these kind of requirements when it comes to treating thus far with some of these non-regulated contaminants, even if laws pass through EPA and MCLs are created, that's still just going to be a requirement for public water supplies, not private wells. So even similarly to radiologicals and other contaminants that may not be regulated at this time, OEE has helped develop public health goals. Again, we're trying to understand the health impacts, understand current knowledge gaps, and develop fact sheets for these contaminants as well. And I discussed it earlier, and I just like to show it. So we're sitting here talking about trying to improve the program, and we're providing a lot more documentation to the health department and residents concerning water quality. So we've seen where we went from just permitting a well and sending results 12 years ago to now we're really diving in deep with residents and trying to discuss their water quality and ensuring that they have all the information they need to make their well water safe. So kind of the last step is the health risk evaluation. And that's obviously a paper form as we speak, but this is the tool that OEE has been working on to make it an online process where we can just select that we're doing a full new well panel, or if you're doing radiologicals or you're doing, just inorganics, you can select those. You can type in the results that you receive from the lab. So say arsenic is 1 milligram per liter. And when you hit enter, it's providing you with kind of steps. If it's red, it's telling the homeowner pretty easy to read that it's saying, stop, don't drink your water. You exceed an EPA MCL. Then we have others that are within range. The pH, total coliform is good. So we throw up a green go sign, and then yield is kind of one of those where we know there could be some health concerns or aesthetic concerns, but it's not an MCL that's regulated. So we're telling you, you may want to think about this one. You might want to put in treatment, or say it was high sodium and you're on a low salt diet. So you might want to remove some of the sodium content in your well. And then one step further, we've been sitting here talking about how we are required at the county level to provide additional guidance, additional treatment options. And this electronic version of the HRE does that as well. So you can see that there are recommendations for whether or not you should drink or cook or bathe, depending upon what contaminants are located. And then there are also links to treatment options. And you can, for the arsenic, there's well water treatment infographics. And so there's a lot of information that we can provide with the click of a mouse. So instead of counties having to spend a great deal of time, I use the example for the well tool, we're providing a ton of information about any contaminated sites near a well, and it literally takes a few minutes. So it's not a huge burden on the county, but it's also providing a ton of information to the residents so they can protect themselves. So what are we looking at for the future of the well program? I feel like most counties are doing a great job at the permitting and inspection part of this. We're ensuring that wells are located in proper areas in relation to potential sources of contamination, whether it's septic or animal barns or any of those that are listed in 2CO 107. But we need to continue looking at water quality concerns. So John Folks, who took over when Nancy left, he has a strong well water background. That's one of his areas of expertise. And he sees the need for our group to hopefully one day begin pushing out more outreach at the county level. There's some, Iredell County I use as an example, has recently done a ton of sampling with Virginia Tech to provide homeowners with additional sampling due to potential health concerns. Wake County has a very good outreach program. Mecklenburg is one of those. So it shouldn't just stop at us issuing an HRE, because we're still kind of cutting short those people that had wells drilled prior to 2008. And then we're really cutting short those people that have had wells for 50 or 60 years. We still have a ton of old board wells that don't meet any of the setbacks. They're not grouted. They're a huge liability, and the homeowners don't understand that because maybe they've never been sick, or the water's always looked and tasted great. Most of these contaminants we deal with don't have a taste and don't have an odor or an odd look to it. So they may be consuming something that is a health risk, and it should be our job to have an outreach program locally to provide information to all well users in the county, and further promote health equity in rural counties. Many of the more rural counties are short-staffed, so it's understandable when you maybe only have 2 or 3 EHSs working in the entire county, and they are doing everything, whether it be food and lodging and wells and septic. They're kind of having to wear all the hats, where some of your bigger counties may have a program dedicated just to groundwater. So we're hopeful that if we can maybe get some rules or some funding, or we at the state level can create more information for counties, then maybe more will join in creating outreach programs if they're not having to create everything themselves. And then obviously providing well owners with solutions. We recently had conversations with UNC and others in the groundwater industry about needing more assistance out there, especially in the more rural areas in the state. Because as I mentioned, you can tell a homeowner that there's a risk with their water quality, but they may not be able to afford sampling. Or even worse, they can afford the sampling, but they know they can't afford the treatment. So what good does it do them to sample if they're going to get results back that tell them their water is harmful, but they can't do anything about it? So I mentioned the Bernard Allen Memorial Fund earlier, and yes, it's done a great job, but that only serves those that are affected essentially by man-made contaminants. It does not address those concerns with naturally occurring. So hopefully in the near future, there will be more programs, more assistance out there to help low-income families with solutions. And I guess this is the time for any questions if you have any.
I don't see any
All right,
questions
must
in the
not be any
chat. Can you see
questions.
the chat? Okay, yeah, I have
Yep,
no
I can
questions
see it
that came
now.
up.
Okay, well, that's fine. Well, if any come up, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be glad to respond.
All right, thanks, Wilson.
Thank y'all. Bye.